I sat in the lobby and watched the glass doors swing open. 2 ghosts walked in, carrying the scent of hospital soap and old excuses. My mother smoothed her hair, while my father adjusted his glasses, looking for a son who died years ago. The receptionist looked at me with a question in her eyes. I took a slow breath and spoke clearly. My parents dumped me for 9 years to care for my sick sister. When they returned, I pretended they were just random people to me. The air conditioning hummed, filling the silence after my words. My mother stepped forward, her arms reaching out in a practiced arc of affection. I didn't move an inch. I kept my spine pressed against the leather chair, feeling the cool grain against my suit. She looked older, with new lines etched around a mouth that used to tell me to be brave. Her eyes searched mine for a spark of recognition. I gave her nothing but the blank stare of a busy professional. She stopped mid-step. "Douglas, honey, it is us," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. I tilted my head, mimicking the polite confusion I used for persistent telemarketers. My father shifted his weight, his face turning a dull shade of red. He looked around the sleek office, intimidated by the success he had never witnessed. I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. He expected me to fold, to weep, and to thank them for coming back. Instead, I checked my watch and sighed at the interruption. "I am sorry. Do we have an appointment?" I asked. The question hung in the air like a physical barrier. My father stepped toward the desk, his voice rising with a familiar, jagged edge. He started to demand respect, claiming they had sacrificed everything for our family. I watched him rant, noticing how he didn't mention my name once. He only talked about his own burden and his own struggle. The receptionist hovered her hand over the security button. I nodded to her, a silent command to wait. My mother started to cry, the tears tracking through her foundation. She reached for a photo in her purse, likely an old image of a boy who no longer existed. I didn't look at it. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket to show off the expensive fabric. I was a stranger they couldn't afford to know. Every inch of me was built from the silence they left behind. They had chosen one child and erased the other. Now, the erasure was finally complete and entirely mutual. "Security will show you to the exit now," I said. I turned my back on them before they could respond. I walked toward the elevators, the rhythmic click of my shoes echoing off the marble floor. My heart didn't race, and my hands didn't shake. Behind me, I heard my father shouting about ingratitude while the guards moved in. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft, metallic hiss. As the car rose, I felt the weight of 9 years finally lift. I was officially a self-made man. The elevator light flickered as I climbed toward my floor. The silence of the office suite felt heavy after the chaos in the lobby. I needed to focus on the regional shipping logs, but my skin felt tight and cold. My reflection in the dark window looked like a ghost of the 10-year-old boy on the porch. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who valued precision over hope. I sat at my desk and opened the first file. A notification pinged on my private laptop, breaking the quiet air. It was an email from my grandfather, Walter. He rarely messaged me during the workday, preferring the scratchy connection of a landline. The subject line was blank, which made my pulse thrum against my collar. I clicked it, expecting a joke about a car engine or a plumbing fix. Instead, I saw a scanned image of a legal document. My parents were suing for visitation rights. The text was a blur of legalese and sharp, demanding phrases. They claimed my grandparents had poisoned my mind against them for a decade. It was a desperate move, a clawing attempt to regain control through a court. I felt a surge of cold fury settle in my gut. They wanted to use the law to fix a bond they had snapped themselves. My hand shook as I gripped the mouse. The door to my past was being kicked open. I called Walter immediately, my voice a low, dangerous rasp. He answered on the first ring, his breathing sounding shallow and tired. He told me they had served him at the grocery store that morning. Diane was crying in the kitchen, terrified of a public battle. My parents were weaponizing the very system that should have protected me. They were painting my heroes as kidnappers. I realized then that my office rejection had only started a much larger war. I will handle this, Walter, I promised, staring at the shipping logs. I didn't need a lawyer to tell me the truth of my life. I had every card they sent with a $20 bill. I had the phone logs showing months of absolute silence. They wanted to play a game of narratives in front of a judge. I would give them a masterpiece of evidence. I closed the email and stood up. My objective was now clear and singular. I drove to the small house where I grew up. The familiar scent of wood smoke and motor oil greeted me at the gate. Walter was waiting on the porch, looking smaller than he did last week. He handed me a box of old records he had kept in the attic. Inside were journals he had written during my teenage years. He documented every time I cried, and every time they failed to call. It was a roadmap of their neglect. I reached the bottom of the stack and found a letter. It was addressed to me, dated 5 years ago, but never sent. The handwriting belonged to my mother, but the tone was different. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for money. She had known I was successful long before today. My parents hadn't come back for a son at all. They had come back for a benefactor. The betrayal finally had a price tag attached to it. The yellowed paper felt like a blade in my hand. I gripped the letter tightly as I walked back into the kitchen. My mother had typed a formal request for $20,000 to cover Lily's debt. She had known my salary, while I was still a junior analyst. The grief I felt for my lost childhood curdled into something sharper and colder. I looked at Walter, who was nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee. He knew everything. "They threatened to sue you if you did not pay?" I asked. Walter nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. He had protected me from their extortion for years by draining his own savings. He had traded his quiet retirement to keep their toxicity away from my door. I felt a deep, pulsing shame for every time I had complained about the small house. My success was built on his sacrifice. The debt was mine, not his. I sat at the wooden table and began sorting through the journals. The entries were meticulous, listing every missed call and every forgotten holiday. Walter had kept receipts for every pair of shoes and every school book. This was not just a family history, it was a ledger of abandonment. I realized that my parents were not just neglectful people. They were predators who saw their children as assets. I had to end this before they broke Grandma Diane, who sat trembling in the kitchen. A heavy knock rattled the front door, making the coffee splash in Walter's cup. I stood up, feeling the adrenaline flood my system like ice water. I opened the door to find my father standing on the porch. He looked different without the office lights, more desperate and more dangerous. He held a thick folder and a smug expression that made my jaw ache. He thought he had found our weakness. He stepped inside without being invited. "We are here to settle this, Douglas," he said. He threw the folder onto the table, covering Walter's journals and my mother's hidden letter. He claimed they had a witness who would testify that Walter stole me. It was a lie so bold it felt like a physical slap. I looked at the folder and saw the logo of a cheap law firm. They were bluffing with paper. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "You are trespassing on private property," I said. My voice was a low, steady hum that vibrated in my chest. I picked up his folder and dropped it into the kitchen trash bin. He lunged for it, but I blocked his path with a solid shoulder. He was soft and old, fueled only by greed and a false sense of duty. I saw the fear flicker in his eyes. He realized I was no longer a child. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the letter from the attic. I held it up so he could see his wife's signature and the requested amount. The smug look vanished from his face instantly, replaced by a pale, hollow mask. He hadn't realized I found the proof of their failed extortion attempt. This was the leverage I needed to bury them. Then, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Lily. The light from the phone screen washed over my father's panicked face. Lily's message was brief but devastating. She told me she had found the hidden bank accounts they opened in my name. They had been collecting government support checks, meant for my care while I lived here. My breath hitched as the depth of their fraud became clear. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had profited from my absence. I looked at the man standing in Walter's kitchen. "You took the money," I whispered. My father tried to look away, but I grabbed his collar and forced him to face the table. I showed him the letter and the phone screen simultaneously. The air in the room felt thick with the smell of old coffee and fresh betrayal. He started to stammer about medical bills and the cost of Lily's survival. It was the same script he had used for 15 years. I didn't let him finish the lie. Walter stood up from his chair, his old joints popping in the silence. He walked over to the trash bin and pulled out the folder my father had thrown. He didn't look at the legal threats inside. He looked at my father with a pity that was sharper than any insult. Walter had known about the checks but stayed quiet, to keep me focused on my studies. He had protected my peace at the cost of his own justice. "Leave this house right now," Walter said. His voice was steady, carrying the authority of a man who had actually done the work. My father looked from the old man to me, his bravado dissolving into a pathetic, twitching mess. He realized the lawsuit would trigger a financial audit. He could never survive. If the state found the diverted funds, he would face more than just a ruined reputation. He would face a prison cell for his greed. My father backed toward the door, his eyes darting around the room for an exit. He didn't look like a parent, or even an adversary anymore. He looked like a small, trapped animal. He fumbled with the latch, nearly tripping over the welcome mat. I didn't follow him onto the porch. I watched through the screen door as he scrambled toward his car. He drove away, the tires screeching against the gravel. The house fell into a heavy quiet. I turned to Walter and saw the exhaustion in his eyes. He sat back down and covered his face with his weathered hands. I felt a surge of protectiveness that outweighed my own lingering hurt. I promised him I would hire the best auditors to trace every cent they stole. We would clear his name and ensure they never stepped on this property again. He just nodded, his shoulders finally dropping. We had won, but the victory felt incredibly heavy. Lily messaged me again before I could set the phone down. She was at a bus station 3 towns away. She had left their house with nothing but a backpack and the truth. She asked if she could stay with me, because she had nowhere else to go. I looked at the empty guest room where I had spent 9 years waiting. The cycle was repeating, but this time, I was the one holding the door open. I gripped the phone until my knuckles turned white. Lily was waiting in the cold at a Greyhound terminal. I told Walter I had to go, grabbing my keys from the hook. He watched me with a mix of worry and pride. I promised him the locks would be changed by morning. The drive took 40 minutes through the winding back roads. My headlights cut through the fog, searching for the sister I barely knew. I felt a strange responsibility. The station was a concrete box smelling of diesel and burnt coffee. I found Lily huddled on a plastic bench near the vending machines. She looked fragile, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. She clutched a worn backpack like it was a shield. When she saw me, she didn't smile or cry. She just stood up with a weary kind of grace. We stood there as strangers sharing the same eyes. She was finally free from them. "I have the flash drive," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She reached into her pocket and produced a small silver device. It contained the digital trail of every check they had cashed over the years. This was the final nail in the coffin for our parents. They had traded our childhoods for a secret hoard of cash. I took the drive, feeling the weight of the data. We walked to my car in total silence. A new storm was brewing. I drove her toward my apartment in the city. The highway was empty, lit by the pale glow of the moon. Lily stared out the window, watching the trees blur into dark streaks. She told me they had planned to use the lawsuit to extort more. They thought I would pay any price to keep Walter out of court. They underestimated my anger and her conscience. She had been their golden child, but she refused to be their accomplice. We arrived at my building and went up to the 10th floor. I showed her the spare room, which was clean and cold. She looked around at the modern furniture and the skyline view. It was a world away from the house of sickness and secrets. I realized I was finally playing the role of the protector. I had spent years being the one who needed saving. Now, I was the one holding the keys to her future safety. I spent the night at my desk, scrolling through the files. The spreadsheets were cold and clinical, detailing years of systematic theft. They had even taken money, meant for Lily's physical therapy. My father had used it to pay off his own credit cards. The scale of the greed was breathtaking and sickening. I felt a sudden urge to burn everything they had ever touched. Then, my phone buzzed with an alert. Someone was at my front door. I looked at the security feed on my monitor. My mother was standing in the hallway, looking directly into the camera lens. She wasn't crying this time. She looked focused and sharp. She held a manila envelope against her chest like a weapon. I realized she must have slipped past the guards during a shift change, likely using an old service key she had stolen months ago. She began to pound on the door with a rhythm that felt like a threat. She knew Lily was inside with me. I stared at the monitor as my mother hammered on the door. The sound echoed through the hallway like a countdown timer. Lily emerged from her room, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. I signaled for her to stay back, keeping my hand on the latch. I felt the vibration of each strike through the solid wood. She was not leaving until she got what she came for. I had to end this tonight or I would never be safe. "Open the door, Douglas," she called out, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. I unbolted the locks one by one, the metallic clicks sharp in the quiet room. I opened the door just wide enough to block her path. She stood there in the harsh hallway light, looking like a hunter. The manila envelope was crinkled in her grip. She didn't look like a mother anymore. She looked like a woman who was losing her last desperate gamble. She stepped closer. "You have something that belongs to us," she said, nodding toward the room where Lily hid. I looked at the envelope and realized it contained the original birth certificates and medical records. She thought she could still bargain, using the papers of our lives. I didn't care about the documents. I cared about the digital trail on my desk. I saw the desperation in her eyes, a flickering light of pure greed. She was willing to burn everything just to save her own skin. "She is staying here," I said, my voice as flat as a stone. My mother laughed. A short and bitter sound that made my skin crawl. She claimed I was kidnapping her daughter and threatened to call the police immediately. It was a bluff, but it was a loud one. She didn't know about the silver flash drive sitting on my desk. She didn't know Lily had already betrayed the family secret. The power balance was shifted, but she hadn't felt the weight of it yet. "I have the audit," I lied, stepping into the hallway to force her back. I watched her eyes widen as she processed the word. An audit meant the end of her freedom and the beginning of a long investigation. She tried to push past me, but I stood firm like a wall. I felt the heat of her anger radiating off her skin. She was trapped in a corner of her own making. The facade of the loving mother was gone for good. Lily stepped out from behind me, holding the silver drive in the air. The hallway went silent as my mother realized the source of the leak. She looked at her daughter with a cold, piercing hatred that broke my heart. It was the look she should have saved for me, not the child she claimed to cherish. Lily didn't flinch or look away. She stood her ground, her hands steady, and her gaze fixed on the woman who failed us. "We are done," Lily said, her voice stronger than I expected. My mother reached out to grab the drive, but I caught her wrist in a firm grip. I felt the bone beneath her skin, fragile and trembling with rage. I told her to go before I handed the drive to the guards downstairs. She realized the game was over. There was no more money and no more leverage. She pulled her arm back and spat at the floor. It was a final, pathetic act. She turned and walked toward the elevators without saying another word. I watched the numbers count down until the lobby light flashed. I closed the door and locked every bolt with a shaking hand. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Lily sat on the sofa, her backpack still clutched to her chest. We had survived the night, but the cost was carved into our faces. We were truly alone now. I looked at the clock. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. I turned to Lily. "Are you okay?" I asked, sitting on the edge of the chair. She didn't answer right away. She just stared at the blank television screen, as if searching for a signal. I realized she had lost her mother and her home in a single hour. I had lost them years ago, but the wound was fresh for her. I reached out and touched her hand, finding it icy. We were survivors of a war that had no heroes. We were just siblings. I looked at the silver drive resting on the coffee table. It was the only thing that kept us safe from their return. I knew the next step would involve lawyers and cold, hard facts. I promised myself I would protect her better than they ever had. As the sun began to rise over the city, I saw a shadow move in the hallway. I looked at the monitor again. My father was standing there, holding a heavy, black gasoline can. The smell of gasoline seeped through the door crack like a physical hand. I grabbed Lily's arm and pulled her toward the balcony. My father's silhouette on the monitor was a jagged shadow of madness. He tilted the plastic container, a dark liquid splashing against the carpeted floor. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like an animal trying to burn its own cage. I realized the vents would carry the fumes into our lungs within seconds. We were trapped. I shoved the heavy dresser against the bedroom door to buy us time. The wood groaned under the pressure as I leaned my weight against it. Lily was hyperventilating, her fingers digging into the fabric of her worn backpack. I told her to hold her breath and stay low to the floor. The fumes were thick enough to sting my eyes now. I looked for a heavy object to break the thick safety glass. Every second felt like an hour in the dim light. "He is really going to do it," Lily choked out. I didn't answer because the truth was a fire of its own. I grabbed a heavy iron floor lamp and swung it at the window. The glass spiderwebbed but refused to shatter on the first strike. I heard the distinct click of a metal lighter from the hallway. It was a rhythmic sound, a heartbeat of impending disaster. I swung the lamp again with every ounce of my suppressed rage. The glass finally gave way. The cold morning air rushed in, pushing back the cloying scent of fuel. I stepped out onto the narrow ledge, pulling Lily after me. We were 10 stories above the concrete, the wind whipping my hair into my eyes. Below, the city was just waking up in shades of gray and blue. I looked back and saw a thin line of orange light snake under the door. The carpet ignited with a soft, hungry roar as he tossed a match through the gap. The hallway was now a tunnel of fire, sealing the only exit. I reached for my phone to call the fire department, but it was gone. It had fallen during the scramble to the balcony. I saw a fire axe behind a glass case on the neighboring balcony, of the adjacent unit. The gap was only 4 feet, but it felt like a mile. I stepped across the void, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the railing and pulled myself over, my shoes slipping on the damp metal. I was separated from Lily by the burning wall. I broke the axe glass and felt the heavy steel in my hands. I didn't head for the fire. I headed for the emergency valve. I knew the building had a manual sprinkler override valve in the maintenance closet, located right next to the utility stairs. I smashed the lock and twisted the red wheel with everything I had. Water hissed through the pipes, a sound of salvation in the dark. The alarms finally began to scream, their mechanical voices cutting through the smoke. The sprinklers drenched the hallway. The fire died down to a smoldering, black mess of soot and steam. I kicked open the scorched door and found my father slumped on the floor. He wasn't burned, but the smoke had taken its toll on his lungs. The gasoline can lay empty beside him like a discarded shell. He looked up at me with eyes that were hollow and defeated. He had tried to kill us both to hide his shame. I stood over him with the axe. "It is over," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I dropped the axe and pulled Lily from the balcony ledge. She was shaking so hard, she could barely stand on her own. I held her close, feeling her heart race against my chest. We walked past our father without offering him a single hand. He was just a stranger in a ruined hallway now. The sirens were getting louder, echoing off the nearby buildings. We reached the stairs. The lobby was filled with residents in bathrobes and confused security guards. I saw my mother standing near the fountain, her eyes searching for the fire. When she saw us, she didn't run over to check our health. She looked at the police officers entering through the revolving doors. She realized the arson attempt would be traced back to her husband. She turned to run, but a firm hand caught her shoulder. The law had finally caught up to her. We sat on the back of an ambulance, wrapped in heavy wool blankets. The paramedics checked our oxygen levels, while the police took our formal statements. I saw the silver flash drive in Lily's hand, still safe. It was the only piece of our past that still had value. I looked at the charred building and realized I had nothing left there. We were alive, but we were completely homeless. Then, Walter's truck pulled into the parking lot. Walter climbed out of his truck, his face a mask of grief. He didn't look at the smoke or the flashing lights. He walked straight to the ambulance and pulled both of us into a single, shaking embrace. I felt the rough fabric of his work, jacket against my suit, stained cheek. His silent tears were the only apology I ever needed for the world. We sat there in the cold morning, 3 people bound by something stronger than blood. The past was finally ashes. The police captain approached us with a heavy folder under his arm. He confirmed that my father was in custody and facing multiple felony charges. My mother was being held as an accessory to the fraud and the arson. The digital evidence on the silver drive had already been verified by the state auditors. They had found even more stolen funds than Lily had originally suspected. It was a total collapse of their hollow lives. Our parents were officially ghosts in the eyes of the law. I realized my apartment was a crime scene and my clothes were ruined. Everything I had worked for was covered in a layer of black soot and water. I looked at Lily, who was still clutching her backpack like a lifeline. She had nowhere to go and no one else to trust. My bank accounts were secure, but my sense of home was completely shattered. I had to decide where we belonged now. The city felt cold and indifferent to our survival. Walter cleared his throat and pointed toward the open cab of his truck. He told us the guest rooms were already made up at the old house. He had spent the early morning hours cleaning out the dust and the memories. There was no pressure, just a quiet offer of a place to land. I looked at Lily, and she gave me a small, hopeful nod. We didn't need the city or the high-rise views to be whole. We just needed the porch. We drove away from the sirens and the smell of gasoline. The rising sun hit the windshield, blinding me for a second as we headed toward the country. I realized that my independence hadn't been about being alone. It was about having the power to choose who stood by my side. I was no longer the forgotten 10-year-old boy waiting on a suitcase. I was a man bringing his sister home. The cycle of abandonment was officially broken by my hand. When we pulled into Walter's gravel driveway, a familiar car was waiting there. It was Coach Henderson, holding a cardboard box of supplies and a fresh pot of coffee. He had heard the news on the local scanner and came to help. He shook my hand firmly, his eyes acknowledging the man I had become. I stepped onto the porch and felt the solid wood beneath my boots. Then, I saw a final envelope stuck in the front door. It was an old, unopened birthday card from years ago that Walter had kept. A quiet reminder of the time we had finally reclaimed.